Did you know that a little over 350 years ago, a humble Indian infantry soldier who fought alongside the French managed to rise to the head of a powerful kingdom in southern India? That this same kingdom, under his son's leadership, the empire stood up to the powerful Maratha Empire and the British East India Company in the 18th century. Today we are going to discover this story, first that of a father, and then in a second part, that of his son nicknamed the Tigers of Mysore. And it's not for nothing that Haider Ali and his son Tipu Sultan would seize the kingdom of Mysore and turn it into a true power. First of all, the kingdom of Mysore. What is it? Before becoming a kingdom, it was a small state in southern India, centered on Mysore city and founded in the 14th century by the Hindu Wodeyar dynasty. By the way, if I mention the religions of dynasties, states, and individuals, it's because they matter and consistently play a role in the relationships between them, especially in India, where various religions have coexisted. So don't be surprised, it's relevant information that will help you better understand the topic. The small state of Mysore was initially a vassal of the mighty Vijayanagara Hindu Empire, which fragmented in the 16th century after a devastating loss to a coalition of Muslim states from central India. Following the defeat, the Raja of Mysore, like many other vassals, declared his independence. From a collapsed empire, the emperor is dead, and in this case literally beheaded by his enemies. And the opulent capital of the empire, where power was centralized, was violently sacked before being simply and completely destroyed. In the decades following the fall of the Vijayanagara Empire, the small state of Mysore gradually became a kingdom, taking advantage of the void left by the absence of central authority in South India in the 1600s. In the next century, political instability in the subcontinent reshuffled southern India's cards again. As the Wodeyar dynasty ruling over Mysore is running out of steam, it offers new opportunities to many adventurers from all backgrounds and social classes. Returning to India, I noted the subcontinent's political instability and the weakness of Mysore's ruling dynasty, offering new opportunities to adventurers from diverse backgrounds and social classes. This was the case for Haider Ali, born in either 1720 or 1722, a Muslim with distant Arab origins. His ancestors had followed the waves of Islamic invasions and occupations of the subcontinent. First in the north, then in the Deccan Plateau, stretching from the subcontinent's center to the south before exploring southern India. This young man was described as dynamic, energetic, and quick-witted, although he had not received any education. For example, he could neither read nor write. He joined the army of the Raja of Mysore as an infantry soldier at 18 and became a cavalry officer a few years later. Amid a shifting and tense context for this small Hindu kingdom, whose ruling dynasty faced serious legitimacy issues. Challenges arose from the lack of direct heirs and the adoption of children to address a ruler's infertility. This occurred in an internal political context where the Raja's army commanders held the actual power. At that time, in the first half of the 18th century, the so-called Carnatic Wars began taking place in the south of India. And the context is complex, but basically involves almost all the Indian states in the area. Alongside France and the United Kingdom, the European powers in the region. As seen in a previous video, the French and English share a fierce desire to deal heavy blows to each other's interests. The unstable and violent context will allow the military man, who was with Haider Ali, to shine, gain experience and influence. During this period, he first encounters the French due to alliances between Mysore and the French East India Company. As a result, the Mysore army, of which Haider Ali is a senior officer, and the French detachments fight side by side in several battles. I'm not sharing this for folklore or anecdotes. This geopolitical fact will be a pillar of Haider Ali's journey and strategy. Without this French involvement in regional affairs, Haider Ali would have had a completely different path. But then, what is France doing in this story, and more generally in the affairs of the Indian states in the region? Well, the French East India Company, under the leadership of Duplessis, who was one of the company's governors, had an ambitious local policy whose main goal was basically to protect French commercial interests by getting involved in local affairs. The aim was to stabilize them, since the region was extremely unstable at the time. while logically making them lean in favor of France. The French established a sepoy force of Indians trained in European methods, creating a competent and formidable army that won multiple battles while being heavily outnumbered. Consequently, French instructors, mercenaries, and those trained by them were in high demand across many Indian states during that period, aware of the opportunity offered by French combat methods. Thus, former sepoys and French officers could be found in almost all the states of southern India. Empire, including Maratha, besides, as we saw in the series we dedicated to him. In 1755, Haider Ali was appointed Faujdar Duke of Dindigul, Tamil Nadu, as a reward for his excellent battlefield service during the Carnatic Wars and against the advancing Maratha military power, the new major regional force. He received this title from Nandaraja, who was the Sarvadhikari, which is basically the prime minister, in the local language of the Kingdom of Mysore, and who controlled the actual power of the state with the support of the army. This promotion gave him significant influence and a territorial base within the kingdom, making this former infantry soldier, who became a cavalry officer and had been loyal and competent until now, one of the main figures of the kingdom. His career was already impressive by then. Haider Ali, a man of modest origins and a foreign religion, rose to power in the kingdom of Mysore through his merits, talents, and the kingdom's religious tolerance. He became part of Mysore's elite and developed his military, political, and diplomatic skills in the context of the alliance between the French East India Company and Mysore. During fierce battles against the kingdom's enemies, he forged excellent personal relationships and mutual respect with several major figures of the French East India Company, including the famous Bussy, whom he met personally during a local succession war in which both the Kingdom of Mysore and the French were involved. Haider Ali was appointed Faujdar of Dindigul. This experience leads him to hire French advisors and soldiers to train his men and organize his army, following the model of the sepoys from the French East India Company. Thanks to this competent and efficient contingent, he will directly contribute to several Mysorean military successes. In 1759, after a campaign, he managed to push back the Marathas. Haider Ali is promoted by both the Raja of Mysore and his minister Nandaraja to the symbolic rank of prince. Haider Ali becomes Nawab Haider Ali Khan Bahadur. This promotion actually illustrates the rise of Haider Ali, who now holds a prominent place in the political elite of the kingdom. A few months later, the Raja, whom I will now call king to avoid confusion, the king of Mysore dismisses his powerful minister Nandaraja after a falling out. Refusing the disgrace and with strong army support, he barricades himself in Mysore with thousands of men, thus plunging the state into a civil war from which Haider Ali will benefit. It should also be understood that this situation breaks out while the external situation is particularly unstable. The Marathas frequently raid the kingdom. Southern Indian states, particularly the large state of Hyderabad on the kingdom's northern border, are facing considerable political instability. This occurs amidst the violent clashes between the French and English in the region during the 7 Years' War. Haider Ali sends 7,000 to 9,000 men led by his brother-in-law to aid the French besieged in Pondicherry by the British. Unfortunately, this intervention is countered by the British and therefore does not affect the outcome of the siege. In short, just remember that it's a very volatile and dangerous environment where almost anything goes. Amid civil war in the kingdom of Mysore, the king seeks Haider Ali's help to recapture the city. He thus finds himself at the head of the remaining Mysore army. The army not barricaded with Nandaraja in the city will march on it with 4,000 cavalry, 6,000 infantry, and the royal artillery. The siege will be difficult and brutal, with well-trained soldiers on both sides facing each other, resulting in heavy, costly losses. In the kingdom, Nandaraja is still trapped with no real way out. He eventually negotiates and agrees to withdraw in exchange for a fief that allows him to live out his days comfortably. Following this, Haider Ali becomes the effective leader of the entire Mysorean army, giving him an influence in the running of the kingdom that is hard to challenge. As a result, a whole series of intrigues are set in motion to counter this power, which seems excessive to a large part of the court. Some Mysore elites now view Haider Ali as too burdensome and believe he must be eliminated. Consequently, a plot is devised, causing a section of the capital's garrison to turn the cannons on the city walls, directly toward Haider Ali's house, with the aim of literally blowing him and his supporters to pieces. Frankly, these men wouldn't think twice about using a bazooka to obliterate a squirrel. Except that despite this idea and all these resources, the plan's gonna fail. And yes, Haider Ali, who is completely taken by surprise, still manages to get out of there, not without difficulty, as you can imagine. And that's not all, because not only did he manage to get away, but he comes back a few weeks later with an army. So you really couldn't afford to mess up, right? And here we go again. The kingdom plunges into another internal conflict. This time, Mysore's side is controlled by the Maratha Empire, which sends a mighty contingent of its renowned cavalry. Haider Ali relies on his influence network in the kingdom and army, yet still faces a challenging situation. The Marathas, at the height of their power, send a significant force. According to a contemporary source, the Maratha forces, consisting of 10,000 cavalry and 6,000 troops loyal to the Mysore king, were well organized and confident at the time. Haider Ali must gather troops from a weakened army to face his opponents, following the recent internal conflict. He can rely on around 3,000 men and a small, well-trained artillery. Considering the balance of power, the situation is extremely difficult for him. But he is saved by the Afghan invasion of northern India, which is controlled by the Marathas, and whose consequence is the disaster of the Battle of Panipat. For the Marathas, as we saw together in a previous video with Quentin from the channel Sur le Champ, this serious defeat forces the Maratha Empire to redeploy its forces to northern India and to settle for stabilizing their borders in the south, leading to the urgent recall of the Maratha contingent. Present alongside the king of Mysore, seeing a real opportunity, Haider Ali feels that he must try something now. He departs for Seringapatam, the kingdom's effective capital where the king resides. He gathers a force of 6,000 infantry and under 3,000 cavalry, while the king's army has 6,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, including 2,000 Marathas, who were probably mercenaries and were therefore financially supported by the king. The loyalist army of the king of Mysore, larger and more confident, then marched to meet Haider Ali and managed to rout him. Haider is resourceful and knows he's risking it all, despite the odds seemingly against him. If he is defeated, there will be no mercy for him. So he decides to risk everything by turning to Nandaraja, the previously defeated deposed minister, who still holds influence over a significant part of the army and territory. His plan is simply to offer him back his position as Sarvadhikari, that is, as prime minister and effective leader of the state. Nandaraja joins Haider Ali's rebellion against the king. This fact will alter the situation completely, as when the armies meet, unease settles on the loyalist side, to the point that the commanders loyal to the king of Mysore realize that the troops might not follow them into battle against the opponents of their former commander-in-chief, who was highly respected by a large part of the army, and so they prefer to give up on a battle whose outcome is more than uncertain. The loyalists therefore give the order for a cautious retreat, which, however, will not be followed by a large part of the army, who do not move and even go so far as to join the contingent commanded by Haider Ali and Nandaraja, which shows that the loyalist commanders had sensed this would happen. In 1761, Haider Ali adeptly reversed the situation by depending on his prior enemy, Nandaraja. Due to these events, he took control of much of the kingdom's territory. The king's remaining loyal forces are defeated, compelling him to make a peace deal that grants actual power to, you guessed it, in exchange for a pension and keeping his title symbolically. Haider Ali Nandaraja regains his position as prime minister as planned, but his influence and power are significantly limited by Haider Ali. From then on, the new master of Mysore, Haider, strives to stabilize both the kingdom and his own power by positioning trusted men in key roles and working to secure the territory's borders. The state itself, due to all this internal and external chaos, is simply in a state of bankruptcy. In other words, the state can no longer fulfill all its commitments and costs. And there's not a single penny left in the treasury. An urgent solution must be found for this. so Haider must quickly find a way to keep things running. So he targets local lords, neighbors of his kingdom, in order to extort tribute from them, before pillaging the southern region of a likely weakened Maratha empire following their devastating loss at Panipat. However, this last point was a mistake, since the Marathas had time to recover under the firm hand of the new Peshwa, that is, the leader of the Maratha Empire. A certain Madhav Rao Mysore will undergo a severe punitive expedition that Haider manages to slow down with his skill, but without actually defeating it. However, the situation clears up when the Marathas get new reinforcements. Haider Ali, having faced them before, realizes he lacks the resources to halt this army's advance, compelling Mysore to pay tribute to the Marathas. However, despite this big setback, it must be said, the kingdom is doing better. Haider's campaigns were financially successful, filling the treasury despite the major scare. The Marathas push Haider to look for a solution to this constant threat on his borders, urging him to take the time to thoroughly reform and modernize the core of his army, which has been weakened by years of past conflicts. For instance, he will standardize his men's gear by giving them uniforms and firearms, something that wasn't so obvious, at least not on this scale. In the art of Indian warfare at the time, for example, he also replaced the traditional instruments of Indian armies with European-style drums. They even formed shock regiments directly supported by camel-mounted anti-personnel artillery. This new army will literally roll over the small neighboring states of the kingdom, whose armies are less trained and still operate in the old ways. It was allowed to expand its borders, especially along Kerala's rich coast. The year 1766 is a new turning point, rich in events. The puppet king of Mysore dies, and his son becomes the new king in title only. The Marathas invade again, and Haider pragmatically chooses to pay them tribute once more. Despite his reforms, his army remains weak. In the same year, Haider eliminates his greatest enemy, Nanda Raja, whom he had helped rise to power, but who, as prime minister, was the final check on his authority. He does this through a rather dishonorable trick, arresting Nanda Raja after having sworn that he would not harm him. India was indeed a Game of Thrones, without dragons for a long time, making Haider Ali's life challenging as a result. In 1767, the first conflict erupted between Mysore and the British East India Company. The British emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War in India, outmaneuvering Haider Ali's ally, the French, and some of whom actually came to seek refuge at his court. Mysore can theoretically count on an alliance with the Nizam of Hyderabad, who has a chaotic relationship with the British, since they had in principle signed a treaty of alliance with them the previous year, which is clearly not being respected. This conflict allows Tipu Sultan, Haider Ali's son, to prove himself as his father and trust him with full responsibility, a contingent making him one of the senior officers in the Mysore army. The first phase of the conflict is to the disadvantage of the allies, who are, for example, severely defeated by the British at the Battle of Changama, despite their overwhelming numbers. It's important to note that the Nizam of Hyderabad's army is very traditional, while Mysore's army is only partially reformed. Consequently, the army opposing the British resembles an Indian army from the late 17th century more than a purely European one. Despite the efforts of Haider Ali, implementing these changes naturally takes time and only applies to his regular troops, which make up just a fraction of the army. In any case, these initial difficulties in the conflict prompt the Nizam to switch sides once again, leading to new agreements with the British and the withdrawal of his army. Haider Ali suddenly finds himself alone and cornered as a result. Initially, he survives through strategic moves, a few wins, and targeted attacks before holding his ground. The British army faced a two-pronged strategy to lead part of the army in a rapid movement toward Madras, the nerve center and economic hub of the British East India Company. However, given the ongoing operations, the latter was poorly defended. The situation is balanced again, with Haider's movements putting severe pressure on the British, forcing them to accept a truce. The Treaty of Madras, though not resolving much, includes a defensive pact binding each party. The Kingdom of Mysore and the British East India Company agreed to support each other if either was attacked. The treaty pushes Haider to provoke the Marathas encouraging them to attack in 1770. The British, respecting the treaties they sign as always in India, will hurry to do nothing and let Haider Ali face completely alone the army of the leading power of the subcontinent at that time. This event will be a definitive diplomatic turning point for Haider, for whom the British, because of this behavior, become from then on a fully acknowledged enemy. As in previous times, the imbalance is major and things go badly. Haider Ali suffers multiple defeats, notably at the Battle of Chinkuri, leading him to confine himself in Seringapatam. In 1771, however, he will hold the place with a competent and fierce defense before a new external event allows him to get out of it. Commander Mara receives, in June 1772, an imperative order to put an end to the conflict. And why? The empire's leader is gravely ill, prompting the central authority, Marat, to prepare for potential future instability. Haider Ali gets away once again by paying a tribute, but also by giving up part of his territory. The following year, as anticipated, the Marat Empire experiences serious unrest after the leader's death, resulting in its collapse and transition into a confederation. Haider Ali aims to exploit the situation as a new war erupts between him and his son Tipu, which will favor them this time. The Marathas become deeply divided, unable to mobilize forces as powerful and unified as before. Meanwhile, Haider has learned from his mistakes. Within months, Tipu, Haider Ali's son, reclaims the ceded lands and expands his state's authority, seizing the opportunity. All this while winning several battles against the Marathas. In 1775, the Nizam of Hyderabad allied with the Marathas and sent an army of about 20,000 men against Mysore. But don't worry, you're beginning to understand these complex individuals. The Nizam's army retreats without engaging in battle when confronted by the Mysore army for reasons unknown. One source suggests that the commanders of the Nizam got scared. However, given the era's practices and the Nizam's consistently weak commitment, it's more likely that these commanders were bribed. Generous bribes, encouraging them to turn back without risking real sanctions upon their return. Once again, the Nizam's army proves to be an unreliable ally which benefits Ryder in this case. The Marathas' default victory was due to their inability to mount a coordinated offensive against Haider, yet their defense did not break down. Ali ends the conflict, which no longer directly involves the Marathas from then on. Meanwhile, the American War of Independence erupts on the other side of the world, providing a pretext for a new war among European states. The conflict will also significantly impact India, as strange as it may seem. In this context, France goes to war with Great Britain in 1778. On this occasion, the King of France at the time, Louis XVI, launches a real expedition to India. The expedition is led by the Marquis de Bussy, Haider's acquaintance, with naval support from the capable Vice Admiral Suffren Haider. In this context, Ali had strictly forbidden the British from seizing the French trading post of Mahé, which was located on this land, and which, in his own words, he claimed to protect. This prohibition would be ignored by the British, prompting Haider to declare war on the British in 1779. At that time, the geopolitical context led Haider to join forces with none other than the Marathas. Surprisingly, they are already at war with the British East India Company. He also calls on his French allies, who initially send him support, 165 soldiers, to supervise the Mysore army, as well as a significant amount of weapons and equipment, greatly strengthening Haider's striking force. In July 1780, Haider deploys a formidable army of 83,000 men with 100 heavy artillery pieces, which is objectively a significant artillery train. Especially in India, the British are at first literally swept away in the south of India by this powerful army. First at the Battle of Polalore, where Tipu manages to pin down a British force, before it is crushed by the arrival of the main Mysore army. Following the victory, Arcot Fort falls. Subsequent skirmishes cause an active, disorganized British retreat toward Madras. However, British reinforcements from Bengal arrived the following year, commanded by the competent and experienced Sir Eyre Coote, who had actually defeated the French at the Battle of Wandiwash 2 decades earlier, will turn the tide. He dealt Haider Ali's army several serious blows, providing the British some relief in southern India. However, this did not break Haider, whose army retreated but held firm. The trend reversed again in 1782. Tipu Haider Ali's son defeats 2,000 British sepoys as Haider captures Kolar simultaneously. Gundlupit, which he holds so that the French can land and organize a coordinated action. This allows Suffren and Bussy to land there in the year's final months. In 1782, there were just over 2,000 combat-ready men and 700 sick men. So, as we saw in the mini documentaries about the history of France and India, the French expedition initially had 8,000 men, but the journey and various events along the way considerably reduced this number. Haider, for his part, who was able to see his friend again? Bussy, who had also convinced the King of France about this expedition, and who was also able to meet the Vice Admiral. Suffren, before this landing, unfortunately won't have time to see the impact of this arrival, since he passed away on December 7, 1782 in his campaign tent, somewhere on the front of this war. However, his death will be kept secret until the arrival of his son Tipu, who then becomes Tipu Sultan, the new ruler of Mysore. Thus, Haider Ali, a skilled military man of humble origins, became the effective ruler of the kingdom of Mysore, whom he made powerful by steering with a firm and steady hand. Despite the many difficulties and defeats he faced, he passed away and handed over power to his son Tipu Sultan, who would be nicknamed the Tiger of Mysore. What do you think will happen, and will France be able to influence the conflict? What will Tipu Sultan do in this war, and what kind of leader will he be? I'm sure you have an opinion on this, so let me know in the comments. A mini documentary about Tipu Sultan will be dedicated to him, and you can find it at the end of the video once it's published. Thank you for watching. I'm always pleasantly surprised to read about your interest in Indian history. Finally, please take a moment to write and tell me what you liked or didn't, by the way, as well as to ask me any questions you might have about Haider or Tipu. I'll see you in a moment for more stories.